And I just want to jump in here because the origin of this, the origin story, as they say, is super interesting. So you were actually, I believe, a real estate agent. You were a mother of three. You had no college education. You were a single mother. And for those who don't know, because I was doing some research on this, and I was born in '69, so I was a young boy in 1980. Um, Carrie, your daughter, was killed. The person who was arrested was 47-year-old Clarence William Bush. Turns out he had been drunk at the time of the crash, but then you found out that he was arrested for another drunk driving crash the night before he killed your daughter. He was released on bail that same morning, stopped at a neighborhood bar on the way home. He hits and kills Carrie. It was his fifth drunk driving offense in 4 years, and here's the kicker. He was driving with a valid California driver's license when he killed Carrie. Back then, was it a crime to drive drunk? It was a totally different world and a worldview, correct, Candace?
No, it was a crime. It simply was a crime that wasn't enforced. When we went after prison for him, and we looked, and now we didn't have the internet. This is way back in the day, and Google and all these other things, but we couldn't find anybody in the United States at that time in 1980 who had been incarcerated for felony drunk driving. And he didn't go to prison, actually. He went to a halfway house for 16 months, where he was still able to drive his car to and from work, and he was still able to go home on the weekends. Now, I did put a stop to that as soon as I found out that was happening, which was sort of an accident. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known. And actually, even without my intervention, the California legislature did pass a bill at that time they named after my daughter that did take away his license. And it was something like after 3 offenses, your license was removed, but not when he was sentenced. He was still driving on a valid California driver's license. So when I see people today, and I hear a lot from victims constantly, and a lot of them aren't happy because the sentences were 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, whatever. And I understand their frustration, but at the same time, I think back, and Bush was only the second person that we could find in the state of California that was incarcerated as a result of MADD. The first person that was incarcerated was also as a result of MADD. It was another chapter that we had started in Southern California, and that guy was also incarcerated, again, halfway houses. Now, of course, it's all different. You know, they go to prison, they have ignition interlock devices, et cetera, but not in those days. They didn't. It just wasn't enforced.
And amazingly, this wasn't the first time someone in your family was struck by a drunk driver. Is that right?
My son, actually, when he was 4, was run over by a driver on prescription meds, and he was in a coma and has permanent brain injury and a plate where his skull was. And then the twins and my mother were hit by a drunk driver when the twins were about 18 months old. And that ended up being a 3-car collision. And Carrie, Serena, Carrie's sister, actually was the one injured in that crash, but not seriously. So yeah, that was, we've sort of had a run of car crashes in this family.
But Candace herself was in a car accident, right? You yourself were in an accident. Did I understand?
A crash. Yeah. I was about 7 years ago, which broke my back. And that was a distracted driver. That was actually a nurse and a woman who was on her cell phone and hit me from behind, totaled my car and hers. And it did break my back.
Before that, though, did you ever speak to the person that killed your daughter?
If you ever saw the movie, I had a conversation and met his wife. And we actually were together during the trial. And then, and I did talk to her a number of times afterwards. He had had a number of other crashes, not only that we all know about, but that we didn't know about, that she told me about, that he ended up paying people off, et cetera. So this is true. So he was an alcoholic. And I asked her several times, why didn't you leave him? Well, she didn't work outside the home, and he was the main provider, and she had children, and she wasn't sure she could make it on her own. So I asked her, we started getting letters from wives of alcoholics, And I'm not a wife of an alcoholic, and I don't know what it's like to be one. So I asked her if she would volunteer for us and respond to these letters. And she said yes, and she did. So whenever I would get letters from, family members of alcoholics who wanted to know what to do, I would give them to her, and she would respond. So we did have a kind of a relationship. I was only able to confront him after he killed my daughter and was sentenced to a halfway house. As soon as he got out, he was given his driver's license. And that night he had another drunk driving crash. He hit a young girl who had the same name as my daughter, Carrie, who was the same age as my daughter would have been had she lived. And it happened within about a mile from where he killed my daughter. And it was big major news because of because it was him and me and whatever. And also because when he was sentenced the first time and the press interviewed him, he said, I'll never do this again. I give my right arm, blah, blah, blah. And then they came to me and I said, mark my words, he will do this again. And he did. So it really was major, major news. So he went to court, and the young gal, he didn't kill her or anything. He just injured her, and it wasn't serious. And so when I was going to court a couple of years before, I didn't have the opportunity to face him. It wasn't allowed then. We changed that, by the way, but at that time it wasn't allowed. When he went to court on the latest drunk driving, it was allowed, and Carrie opted to allow me to speak instead of her. So for the first time, I actually was able to go into court, confront him about what he had done to my daughter and what we had suffered as a result.